Hello, it's Thursday night. It's another edition of Yisrael Chai. I'm your host, Alexander Menashe, and my co-host is with us as well. That's Joseph Cohen. And today we've got two very interesting subjects that we're going to talk about. One is kind of light, and we're going to start with that one. And the second subject is much more serious and much more grave issue that we're going to talk about. So the first thing that we're going to speak about is there's a celebrity Jewish con man. Well, and I say Jewish in inverted commas, not because he's a convert that some or other stream disagrees with, but because he's actually not Jewish. He's posing as a Jew, and so we're going to be talking a little about him. Both myself and Joseph have actually know this guy personally. He's hit the headlines again, I should say, and the second question is really the disgraceful scenes that we're seeing in Gaza on the border, the tragic death of Barel Khadaria Shmuli, and the way that the media is covering that story. So the first thing is this guy. He goes by the name of David Edward Sassoon, and he claims to be a scion of the famous Sassoon banking family, which was an Egyptian Indian family, and he is. I'm not quite sure even who that picture is. Who is that picture of, Joe?
I have no idea, but just to quickly interject, so I stumbled across the story on United with Israel, which is a great organization. If you're not following them on Facebook, follow them. They're great. And they had this story. The world's oldest Jewish trust committed $50 billion to Israel. I was like, well, we don't have any funding in the Israel advocacy movement. We depend on small Patreon donations from you guys, and anything that you do to help really goes a long way. So thank you if you are one of our supporters. But I thought this is maybe something we could tap up. $50 billion goes a long way in the advocacy world. And it went on to say that the Sassoon Family Continuation Trust will create 3 different funds to secure the economic growth of Israel and fight anti-Semitism. So fantastic. We fight anti-Semitism. This is right up. And so I started reading, and it was like the Sassoon Family Continuation Trust, established in 1485 during the Spanish Inquisition, has recently announced that it will commit $50 billion across 3 funds to fulfill a mandate to ensure economic growth and market impact for Israel. $100 billion of financial assets are currently being relocated to the US from Switzerland, half of which will end up in Israel. There's a vacuum here, and someone needs to fill it, David Sassoon told CTEC, and that's when the penny dropped. David Sassoon, where do I know that name from? And I reached out to Alexander, and I was Alexander Menashe. Is this our David? Is this the David that tried to con me, tried to con you, tried to con rabbis we know, tried to con at least 2 rabbis we know?
Tried to con a couple of businnesmen that we know as well.
And
it's crazy. I actually didn't recognize the picture. I think he's lost weight in prison because I didn't quite recognize the picture. So this is really the story. I met David about 2 or 3 years ago now. That he was in a synagogue. Met him at the end of the Shabbat prayers, and befriended him. We started talking, and he told me his backstory. He was a former U.S. Marine, etc., etc. It all turned out to be a complete pack of lies. I'm not going to bore you with all the details. This guy, he is a fantasist. And when I first understood that he's got some crazy stories, so he claimed he's in military intelligence, and it started off that he was an agent, and then it turned out his father was a CIA agent, then his mother was also a CIA agent, then he was involved in the capture of Bin Laden. He worked at Guantanamo, a whole loads of nonsense that sort of strained credibility. And he was just really out to try and swindle money out of people. That's the bottom line. So his latest scam is to go around asking people to donate money on the basis that he's going to invest it in Israel rather than in his in his own bank account.
For me, is the thing that blows my mind is the volumes of money he talks. So when I spoke to him, he told me he was a descendant of both the Rothschild and Sassoon family. And a friend of mine, a rabbi, was in the process of launching a business in the UK, a tech startup, and he was trying to get involved in it. And my friend thought he was going to invest large sums of money because here you have a Rothschild and a Sassoon, two of the biggest banking families that the world has ever known. And something wasn't quite right. His stories were just too elaborate, too far-fetched. And this is another example. It's not that there's $5 billion or $1 billion to invest in Israel. It's $50 billion from a trust that was set up in the 15th century. It's like, and crazily, people printed this story. It was in the Jewish week. It was on I think it was it Jewish week? It was on another different website. Anyway, it was
Haaretz picked it up. It was in Calculist, which is I think owned by Haaretz, or Caltech, which is owned by Haaretz, I think. So yeah, it's been picked up by stories. He's had stuff picked up in the past, like when he first launched this a while ago. He got a few people interested reporting on business pages, and then I think the JC covered it, and that kind of disappeared. But he's obviously decided to go big or go home, I guess, with his $50 billion claim. It's just a really weird thing because go on.
Just going to say our shares, actually, they've got a website. Bear with me. I was just trying to monetize our video, and as usual, denied monetization. So there's going to be no every single time. But I was just going to show this is his actual website they've got for the J Sassoon group. It all looks very professional. They've got a team set up. How many of these people actually are in the team? I'm highly skeptical. But here we just zoom in on that. You've got Sharon. We know one of her families. This is his wife. I believe a rabbi even officiated at their wedding, even though David Sassoon isn't Jewish and hasn't been able to prove to Beit Din that he's Jewish, because he isn't Jewish.
Well, this is the other really interesting thing about it is the thing that he's claiming. So Sharon is, as far as she is Jewish. We know one of her family members. We know friends of hers. So we know for a fact that she's Jewish. She lives in Israel. She actually knows the husband of the person who set me and my wife up. So that was one of the reasons why when we first met her and David, we felt a connection with them, and befriended them. So Sharon is a real person. David is a real person. The thing with David is not his real name. His real name is as far as I know, his first name is Khalid.
Good Jewish name.
Nice Jewish name, Khalid. Exactly. I can't remember his family name. So according to the Home Office, let's start it from the beginning. David claims that his parents are Egyptian Jews who fled Egypt in the 60s, settled in America. His father became a doctor. His mother was also a doctor. He claims that his father was murdered in Sudan while working for the World Health Organization. He claims that his mother was murdered in the AMIA bombing in Argentina. And there's something actually you found in connection to that, I believe, Joe. You found that he's actually sued the government of Iran. This is just kind of some of the outlandish things that he's done. So here is a case number. It was filed here, we can see, in 2017.
Yeah,
I'm not entirely sure.
So the plaintiffs are David Edward Sassoon, the Katoui family, and the Sassoon family.
So he claims, so I think Sassoon, he claims his father's name, and Katoui was his mother's maiden name. As it turns out, or at least as far as the UK Home Office is concerned, they believe that he's a Sudanese Muslim who was born in Egypt in a refugee camp. He's spent time in prison in America. Here we go. We've got the JC article, which gives you a bit more information. This is all stuff that you can find. It's very well known. I've spoken with the journalist who's published these articles. So yeah, I mean his whole story is just like, more holes than Swiss cheese. It's really not credible. And I've spoken with his prison chaplain as well, who the rabbi who went to him in prison. So we don't really know exactly what his connection is to Judaism, if he has any. He claims that he has Jewish ancestry. It doesn't seem to be the case, but obviously, the prison chaplain, as he said to me when I spoke to him, he said, "Look, I don't go and ask people if they want to see a rabbi. I don't go and ask them to, for their parents' ketubah. I just go and offer my services to prisoners." So it's when he was serving, I believe, in a prison near to Nottingham, that he first, I think, had this idea of getting involved in the Jewish community. And of course, Jews, we've got loads of money. If you want to steal things, if money is your interest, who better to go after than Jews?
And I mean, and either to do it in an anti-Semitic way, to tap into the anti-Semitic stereotypes of rich banking families and using, you can just imagine him being on some anti-Semitic rabbit hole, reading about the Rothschilds, reading about the Sassoon family, reading about all these rich Jewish banking families from 100 years ago, and thinking, I want some of that. I'm going to steal their pedigree to fleece the Jewish community, which is what he went on to do. But anyway,
I mean. Well, actually, he's, in terms of the Jewish community, I think he wasn't, as far as I know, he wasn't able to con anyone out of a significant amount of money. There are people that I've been in contact with who, because obviously when I first found out that this guy was potentially a crook, I didn't want to just go around making baseless accusations. So I actually did a lot of detective work to uncover the story of and the truth of the allegations against him. So I spoke with his ex-girlfriend, who said that she didn't know if he was Jewish, but that when she used to live with him, he would spend a lot of time in the mosque, which she didn't think most Jews did that. She told me various other things. She gave me a copy of his UK immigration identity card that showed that he's an asylum seeker. All various things. He also claims that he wants to make Aliyah. This is another one of his claims that he makes, that he's on the verge of making Aliyah. There's no, whether this is because he's a stateless individual and he wants to gain a passport, I don't know, but also it gives him some kind of legitimacy in terms of his scams, the type of thing that we're seeing now, where he's claiming he's got 50 billion. I mean, $50 billion is really just a ridiculous amount.
Especially if you went to where he was living, and it didn't match up to $50 billion trust. But anyway, I think let's move on to the much more serious matter that we were, which really prompted the podcast.
Well, there is kind of a connection to the two things, because just in terms of this story, you would have thought, like, if someone came to a journalist and said, "Hi, my name's so and so, and I represent a fund that's got $50 billion to invest in Israel," you would think that before publishing the story, that the journalist would do more than just click on a website that anybody can presumably knock up in half an hour. So I think this kind of, in some ways, there is a link to the kind of journalistic standards that we're going to discuss a bit later on, or the lack of journalistic standards. But so the second subject for today is really it starts with the violent riots that we've been seeing on the Gaza border. And as we know, on the 21st of August, I believe, this very brave and unfortunate young man who was tragically killed, his name is Barel Khadaria Shmuli. He was just 21 years old. And, he really is a hero. There's no other way to describe him. He's put his life on the line to defend the people of Israel. He was in his mandated military service. He volunteered to join the border police. He joined an undercover unit trained as a sniper, and he was involved in many successful operations that save lives of his fellow Israeli citizens. So he really is a hero. And I think one of the other things is maybe if people don't live in Israel or haven't lived in Israel or don't really understand, when these things happen in Israel, it's something that touches all of us, because everybody in Israel knows somebody or has a family member who has sadly been killed in the war that beset our nation for the last 75 years. So it's really to just say that this guy is really sad that he was shot in the head at point blank range, and despite the intensive efforts of the medical professionals, he was unable to save his life, and he passed away. I think 2 or 3 days ago.
We actually have a video of the attack. Let me just play that. So again, very graphic.
So yeah, there you saw someone creep. Go on.
No, please.
Well, no, there you just saw for yourself. You can see the barrel of his rifle poking through this gap in the border wall. Someone's hitting it with a stick. He pulls it out, and then someone else creeps up and fires off a couple of rounds through the gap, fatally wounding this very brave young man.
And I think one of the most shocking aspects of this story is how it's being framed or not being framed. So if the incident or the incidents are being reported in any way, it's to say that there are protests on the Gaza border. Now, these aren't protesters. I've been on many protests. People wave placards around. People chant on megaphones. People don't come with guns and murder people in cold blood. That's not a protest. That is an act of terror. And what's really, really shocked me is I challenge anyone that's watching this now to find mainstream Western media organizations that are running with this story. And I'll give you an example of what I mean. I'm going to share my screen very quickly. So bear with me. Let me add this back into the chat. So hopefully you can see this. So basically, I went onto Google and I searched the BBC. So if you can look at this, I'll zoom in so you can really see this. This is how you do searches you type in your search term, the website you want to search. You type in your keyword, and we've done basically all of his names, and then anything that was posted after the date that he was shot. And what you'll find is that every single mainstream. So I went to CNN, I went to the New York Times, I went to the Guardian, and none of them are running with a story. They're just not. Now, in contrast, if I look at Palestinian or Palestine in that same time frame, 331 stories. See that? 331 stories on the BBC. CNN, 167 stories. The New York Times, 88 stories. The Guardian, 213 stories. And they're talking about various people who've been killed, but no mention on the Guardian of an Israeli who was murdered in cold blood. And if this doesn't highlight the bias in the way that the Western media reports on the Israel-Hamas conflict, I don't know what does. It's in your face. Hundreds of stories published on individual news outlets, and not one of them mentioning an Israeli who was killed in cold blood.
Yeah, and I think the other thing to mention is, this isn't a soldier who's part of an operation inside Gaza who's been killed by Palestinians defending themselves. This is a guy who's been stationed on the border to defend Israeli Jews from people who want to tear down the border fence and run across and murder Israelis. I mean, we know from these are ongoing border disturbances. There's actually this is where we kind of get to really see the bias and the way that the media just omits so much information. So we know that these aren't, when we think of a protest, we live in democracy. So when we think of a protest, we think of people that voluntarily turn up to an event to voice their opinion on one particular subject, right? Whether it's against the war in Iraq or, the treatment of the Uyghurs in China, etc., etc. Anything, animal rights against fox hunting back in the day. These are the kind of things that people would normally associate with demonstrations. It's a group of peaceful people that want to go and make a political point about something they don't agree with. And what we see in Gaza is not people turning up waving placards. They're turning up waving slingshots, waving weapons, as we saw. This guy with a handgun. We're seeing people. They're throwing stones at the soldiers. They're setting tires on fire, causing huge environmental pollution because they're doing it. Every night they're burning dozens of tires to create smoke so that people can't. And the reason they burn the tires, by the way, is so that they can shoot at soldiers without being seen. So these aren't just people who've got together and decided that this is what they want to do. These are people. They are Hamas terrorists. The people behind this. There's actually something called the Night Disturbance Unit. So they do this after dark because obviously it's much more difficult to spot people after nightfall, especially if they want to injure soldiers. So this is something that's been going on, and these are not just, this is an international border. This is not just, a group of people protesting something. They're at the very least, they're rioting by any reasonable definition. The other side of it is that this is an international border. If you shoot across an international border, that's an act of war. Whether how Israel should respond to that act of war is a different question. But in a legal terms, that's undoubtedly an act of war, especially if you've been sent by the governing authority. Like Hamas is the governing authority. It's like, can you imagine if the French government sent people to the border with Belgium and instructed them to start throwing rocks over the other side of the border? I mean, that would be considered an act of war if the Russians were doing that on the border with Poland. We'd understand that the Russian government's responsible.
And this isn't throwing rocks. This is firing weapons. And as you said, the reason they set fire to the tires is so that they can provide cover for their militants, their terrorists, to shoot at Israelis. In the same way, and to shoot, any Israeli is a legitimate target, which is why they point their rockets at our cities, at our civilians, at our schools, and the world says nothing. The media say, like, you go on Kenneth Roth, check out his Twitter feed. So he's from Human Rights Watch. Nothing. No, I mean, since that date, I'm just going to count. One, I can see 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11 tweets on the timeline about Israel that mention either Israel or Israeli, and not one mentioning the murder of an Israeli. I mean, it's the same with Rashida Tlaib. Her timeline's filled with comments about Israel and the Palestinians. No mention of this murder. The media, the politicians, NGOs, there's a complete blackout, a complete silence, because they don't care. They don't care, or even worse, they agree and see the killing as a legitimate act, and that's the really shocking thing. There is silence, absolute silence.
The silence is as well. It's an insidious silence because it's trying to, people read the newspaper and they form opinions on the information that they get from news organizations. So if they're hearing only essentially one side of the story, And of course, they're going to form their opinion based on that one side of the story. If they hear that Israel, for example, let's say now Israel decided to launch a military operation against Hamas as a result of this soldier, everyone would be up in arms about how can Israel do this. And many of the people, if they're Guardian readers, if they're getting their news from CNN or the New York Times, they don't know what's happened before. All they see is Israel, quote unquote, being an aggressive, heavy-handed, disproportionate, all the other slogans that get thrown around. And of course, this is not to argue that the death of one soldier justifies a full-on military onslaught in the Gaza Strip. It's just to make the wider point that the media is only telling you one side of the story. They're not giving you a fair and accurate picture, which allows you to draw your own conclusions. Essentially, they're giving you only so much information that you will then accept what they're telling you. You will accept their conclusions, because it's, if you don't know about Arab acts of aggression, then it isn't unreasonable to look at how Israel behaves and to assume that Israel's the aggressor, especially if that's what the media is telling you. If the media don't tell you that Israel's defending itself and its actions are preceded by acts of aggression. And this also, there's one other thing, I'm going on a bit of a ramble here, but there's one other thing that's, I think, highly relevant. One of the things that's not being reported amongst all of this is, what's the aim of Hamas? Why do we even have these riots on the border? Why do we have these disturbances on the border between Gaza and Israel? What's the objective? Now, we know, we've seen in the past, there's a video of a Hamas spokesman from about a year, 18 months ago, where he says, tear down the fence and go and find some Israelis, and and channeling their inner Alan Rickman, saying to tear their hearts out with a spoon. Their aim is to kill Israelis, and the reason that they're doing this is because Israel's basically said, we will not allow the reconstruction of Gaza unless you return the corpses of two soldiers who've now been held. Their corpses have been held now for 7 years inside of Gaza by Hamas. This is, of course, the two Hadar Goldin, and the name of the second soldier has unfortunately slipped my mind. There's also two Israeli civilians. Let me just look for a moment. I don't want. It's Oren Shaul and Hadar Goldin, the two soldiers who've been held, whose corpses have been held hostage by Hamas for 7 years now. There's also two living Israelis who are being held captive by Hamas. There's a guy called Avera Mengistu. He's also been held hostage for 7 years, and another, an Israeli Arab guy whose name is Hisham El Sayed. And both of these people are mentally ill civilians who crossed into Gaza. Obviously, they're suffering from, their families say they're suffering from long-standing mental health problems. They're not really aware of what they've done. Hamas has been keeping them, Avera Mengistu, since 2014, and Hisham El Sayed since 2015. So that's 6 and 7 years, respectively, that they've been held hostage, with no signs of life provided to their families, no visits from the Red Cross, no assurances that their medical needs are being taken care of. And why is Hamas now setting fire to Israeli fields on the other side of the border and nature reserves? Why are they shooting at soldiers? It's because they don't want to make the choice to release two mentally ill people from captivity who've done absolutely nothing wrong. These people are so immoral and so barbaric that they would rather murder people than to release these two soldiers or the remains of these two civilians or the remains of the two soldiers. And this is really the disgrace, that the media is not reporting this either.
I mean, it's not just the media, it's not just Hamas, but one of the real disgraces here is the public. you hear Twitter is filled with thousands, millions of tweets calling for the release of Palestinian political prisoners. Political prisoners being Palestinians that have carried out terror attacks against Israelis and have either been foiled or apprehended after the fact. And these are the political prisoners that the West campaigns for their release. Yet there's no campaigns for Israeli civilians that have been kidnapped and held captive for years and years. There's no protest. There's very little noise from NGOs. I mean, there was a little bit of noise, but in the grand scale of things, there's nothing. They're far more concerned with lobbying for the release of terrorists than they are for the release of Israeli civilians from Hamas.
And
You're on mute.
it's just the other thing it's just mind-boggling. It's just insane. We're not talking about, okay, 2 civilians would be civilians anyway, but these are civilians with mental health problems, and because they're Israelis, there's no human rights organization that's willing to advocate on their behalf. You know, Ken Roth last week was posting about the release of. So there's an issue with because Hamas refuses to release the remains of these 2 soldiers that they've held captive since Operation Protective Edge. The Israeli government has started in the last, I think, 6 months or a year to withhold the corpses of Palestinian terrorists. Now, it's not something personally that I think's a particularly nice thing to do. It's not something that I'm comfortable with. However, it's being done because there's a hope that maybe this will move Hamas to do something that will relieve the anguish of these of the Israelis who can't bury their sons. So, for example, Ken Roth was campaigning last week for the release of, there's several names floating around, and they're always portrayed in the same way. So these are terrorists who are shot in self-defense, either by the Israeli police force who are armed, or the Israeli soldiers who are armed, who are shot when they're in the process of trying to murder people. So we're not just talking about, political prisoners or people who arguably were doing something that might warrant the attention of a human rights organization. We're talking about people who are essentially cold-blooded killers, or would be cold-blooded killers, who, instead of achieving their aims, are actually killed before they can carry out their dastardly plans. So you have people campaigning, human rights campaigners campaigning for on behalf of attempted murderers, but they won't launch a campaign on behalf of mentally ill civilians. I mean, it's absolutely astonishing.
So we've got some chatter in there, the comments, as always. So you guys, I'll just put it on screen. These type of comments every time we do a live stream about Hamas, we get these types of comments. Israel created Hamas. The whole thing is a charade while innocents pay the price. Nita Manko, I'm going to actually post the StreamYard, the live stream link in here. You're welcome to jump on this live stream right now and talk to us about your conspiracy theories. Again, any Hamas supporters in the chat, you're welcome to join us, and we'll actually talk through how perverse and real Hamas are. Hamas is not a made-up entity that Israel created. They were born out of Ikhwan, the Muslim Brotherhood. I've actually just been on Ken Roth's Twitter account. This just says it all, basically. Let me share my screen very quickly so you can see. So if you type, again, you look for tweets that Ken Roth has made on Mengistu, which is the individual, one of the individual surnames, there's nothing. There's no tweet. There was something which is completely unrelated from 2011 to do with the Bin Laden Bin Laden killing. Nothing to do with with this
Yeah,
story.
it's just the
So
same surname.
maybe he's tweeted
The
about
same
it.
surname.
Sorry, say that again.
It's just the same. It's someone with the same surname. It's nothing to do with
Yeah,
this
exactly.
poor Israeli Jewish guy.
Yeah, and
Who's been
so
held in captivity.
100%. And so here we have. He may have tweeted about it using different text. I haven't had time to go complete through his timeline, but there's basically media silence and there's silence from the NGOs. And when it comes to Israel and when it comes to Israeli lives, it doesn't matter whether it's our captives, those that are being kidnapped. It doesn't matter whether it is our Jews that are being murdered. There's silence. There's a blackout. As usual, we've shared the link with the haters, and they're not jumping on the live stream. They're very, very vocal in the chat, but very afraid to actually have their controversial views confronted on camera.
Well, it doesn't surprise me. These people are generally cowards, who many of them who won't actually honestly admit the truth of their opinions. They'll hide behind euphemisms. They'll suggest that they're human rights activists. They'll suggest that they're campaigners for freedom. They're showing solidarity with the Palestinian people. But we know the reality is that many of these people are simply just don't like Jews very much. And they'll look for any pretext to attack Jews and our country. So no one wants to...
So yeah, so I think if no one's going to jump on the live stream, we will call it a day.
Any questions?
If anyone has any questions in the audience, please quickly fire them over, and we'll answer.
Or we'll do our best to answer. We might not know the answers. Maybe Joe knows everything. I don't know everything, but maybe you do.
When it comes to Israel.
They are cowards.
I don't know if the name is pro-Muslim or anti-Muslim, nemesis of the infidels. So I agree, they are cowards.
I mean, there is a cross. There's a cross in the what's it called, the profile picture. So.
Yeah, that would suggest maybe he's not a Muslim. But nemesis of the infidels, your name kind of suggests that you're quite an extreme Muslim, because the Muslims would describe you as an infidel. And anyway, here we go. We've got a question here. So, we were actually going to do today's live stream on this very subject. So we will do a much more in-depth answer to this question, and we really will. But for brevity's sake, we will give you a very condensed answer. I like to see it as Zionism is the destination of Judaism. And what I mean by that is every single religious Jew, whether they support the state of Israel in its current form as the Jewish state, every single religious Jew believes and prays that first believes the Jews will return to Israel, and prays that they will return and rebuild Jerusalem, and they pray for that speedily to happen in their day, multiple times a day. So Zionism is an integral part of Judaism, and religious anti-Zionists are actually not anti-Zionists. They're just religious Jews who don't think it's yet the right time to be Zionist. They're waiting for the Jewish Messiah to arrive, and they believe one of the signs of his arrival will be that the Jews will return to Israel. He'll bring the exiles back to Israel. Zionism as a political movement is slightly different. It was really born in, let's call it political Zionism, was born largely in the 19th century. In every single century, Jews have tried to return. There's been continuous presence of Jews in Israel to begin with, but Jews have tried to return in every generation. The 19th century saw one of the most successful manifestation of those attempts. And that was really born out of political thinkers like Theodor Herzl, who saw Israel as not just our ancestral homeland, but they also saw it as a place of refuge where Jews can escape the centuries and centuries and centuries of persecution that we've been subject to while living under the boot of others, be it Christendom, be it atheists, or be it Islam. And so, really, really short, Zionism is a part of Judaism. You don't have to be religious, you don't have to be Jewish to support the right for Jews to live in that area. But essentially, the definition of Zionism is supporting Jews having the right to self-determination in their ancestral homeland. That is certainly today is how it would be defined. So if you support a two-state solution, you support Israel, and you support a future Palestinian state, I've got good news for you. You're a Zionist. Whereas to be Jewish, you either have to be born of a Jewish mother, or you have to be converted into the faith. And we're a people. Hopefully that answers the question. It wasn't as brief as I'd like to be. Alexander, anything you'd like to add?
So, I mean, I'd just like to say that Zionism is obviously a political movement, and Judaism is a religion. But the fundamental premise of Zionism is that the Jewish people should be a free nation in our land. That's the vision. That's the hope of Hatikva, the Israeli national anthem, Liot am chofshi be'atzinu, to be a free people in our land. And it's to express there are many people who wrote about Zionism, and Theodor Herzl was very secular. So other figures, for example, Rav Kook, who was as his name suggests, he was a rabbi, and others like Echad Ha'am, who had a religious upbringing but who personally rejected orthodoxy, the same as Martin Buber, who also had a religious upbringing but rejected orthodox interpretations. They both understood that the goal of the Zionist movement is to allow the rebirth of Jewish culture, and the full expression of Judaism is just not possible without the land of Israel. There's a whole body of halakha, of mitzvot, of commandments, which are simply only able to be practiced in the land of Israel. So now some of those are obviously connected with the temple sacrifice, and we don't have the temple anymore. But other things are to do with the harvesting of fruits. There's some obscure things in the religion, others less so, that are simply only possible to do in Israel. So the full expression of Judaism is not possible without the land of Israel. And this is where I think many people who consider themselves anti-Zionists really don't understand the connection. They say, Zionism's against Judaism, or Judaism is against Zionism, or really religious Jews don't believe in Zionism, and this is all simply just not forces people. Is not true. It's you cannot have a full expression of Judaism without the land of Israel.
Completely agree. We've got a few more questions. I don't seem to be sharing, but one of them is, let's see if this works. No, it's not going to work for some reason. It's crashed. Do you know when the temple is going to be built? And that's by Terry van der Schaff. Terry, I don't. If I did, I'd know. I possibly be the Messiah, and while I have a nice red beard, just like King David. I'm pretty sure that. I'm not pretty sure. I'm certain I'm not the Messiah. So no,
I think you've got more chance of being the red heifer.
But yeah, no, I don't know when the temple's going to be built, and no Jew knows when the temple is going to be built. So yeah, we wait. Speedily in our days.
As the text of our prayers say, we don't know when it's going to be built, but we hope Moshiach, as religious Jews, we hope the Moshiach will arrive tomorrow, or even this evening after the live stream.
And some interesting facts around that. We're supposed to expect it so imminently that there are really interesting laws. Like many Jews have the tradition of leaving their house incomplete. So they'll have a little square of their house which isn't plastered, and you'll see the exposed brickwork, because we're not supposed to be comfortable outside of Israel. And we are anticipating the Messiah to arrive any moment. There was actually a really good story. I think it was about Rabbi Sachs told it. The late Rabbi Sachs, an incredible rabbi. And he was talking, I hope I remember this story correctly, but I don't want to name the institution in case I get it wrong, but it moved from central London in a big fancy building to a small little building in northwest London. And one of the regulars at the building complained, and he said, it isn't fitting for such an institution. We need something much bigger. And his approach was actually the opposite is true. We shouldn't have these grand cathedrals outside of Israel, because you build grand cathedrals of a synagogue and of an institution because you're establishing permanent roots. Rather, we should have much more humble places where we worship and learn, because the anticipation is that tomorrow we're all going home, we're going to Israel. And Baruch Hashem, we live in a generation where you can hop on a flight and you can live the life that your ancestors dreamed of in their ancestral home in Israel. Aliyah is easy today. It's a flight away. There's no pirates that are going to kidnap you. You're not going to get held to ransom. You're not going to get murdered on a 50-day trek across a continent. Rather, it's
don't even have to pay for the flight.
Exactly. We live in incredibly blessed times. We've got a question here, which I think is a very good question. And it's, what do you think about Christians? And I'm going to give a really honest answer. I love Christians, particularly Christians that don't try to take Jews away from our tradition. So if you are a Christian that loves Israel, that loves Jews, or even if you don't love Israel and love Jews, but you've got no desire to convert Jews from our faith, I love you like a brother or a sister. If you are a Christian that tries to take Jews away from our faith and convert them to your faith, then I maybe withhold that love a little. Maybe we can have a conversation about why that's not such a good thing to do. But yeah, Christians are some of the closest friends of the Jewish people, and we're incredibly grateful of that friendship. Is there anything you'd like to add, Alexander?
Yeah, I think I'd just like to say that what do we think about Christians is not really the question. It's what do we think about Christianity as a religion? We don't have anything against Christians. Christians are by and large in this generation supporters of Israel. We're very glad to have their support. But if they want to have an honest answer of what do we think of their religion and the claims that are made in the names of the church, then obviously we reject those utterly, and we have our evidence and our reasons for why we reject those that are, let me put it this way, it's not what you will read in the New Testament. It's much more substantive than that. And there are places, if people are interested, where they can hear the Jewish religious response to Christianity. I'm not going to mention that because we're not here to we're not a counter missionary organization. If people want to look that up, Google, they can do that for themselves if they're interested.
And I think I would add, we actually have far more in common, even religiously, than that which separates us. You share the Torah, which is a really important book for Christians and a fundamental book for Jews. We share a love for Israel. We share our prophet. You learn from our prophets, from our ancestors, from our patriarchs. So we have far more in common than that which divides. But there are theological differences, and that's why Jews are Jews and Christians are Christians, and that's fine. Each to their own. As long as you don't try to proselytize us, and then we will go counter missionary.
Yeah. And it's one of my favorite subjects. So, it's something I'm happy, maybe not in this forum, but something I'm happy to discuss.
And I think Max Live just adds modern Christian ones who are not actively involved in conversion are good and know how to exist. And I agree. Many of the Israel advocacy movement supporters and volunteers are Christians, and they're some of our closest friends. There's no reason Jews and Christians shouldn't coexist. Certainly in the modern world, we're very close, and we have far more in common than that which divides.
Yeah. Oh,
And
I agree with
I'm
that.
just checking if we have any more questions coming through. Someone was saying we shouldn't give any land to the Palestinians. The only thing I would add to that is there's precedent in the Torah for land concessions. There's land is less valuable than life. Now, I believe Israel has a claim to all of Judea and Samaria legally, morally. I think, ignoring religion, just using secular arguments. However, I think the preservation of human life is very important. And if something were to bring lasting peace, then I, as an individual, would certainly entertain that. But it's definitely not on me as to what land we keep and what land we give away. But I think most Jews, including some of the wildest settlers I know, living in the most remotest of outposts, have told me numerous times that peace is important, but you have to have a partner for peace. And we don't have a peace partner at the moment. And every time we've given away land, that land has been used to mount further attacks on Israel. And so I think most people, myself included, don't see any immediate peace solution where land exchanges would bring peace between Israelis and Palestinians. Maybe in the future that could happen, but certainly not with the current regimes. Alexander, you probably have different views to me, so I'll let you jump in.
So, I mean, my views are not so different from yours. I just say that generally the consensus in Israel now is that there's two questions. Okay, so there's question number one is, does Israel have a right to all of the land that it currently controls? And I think that most Israelis would say, yes, this is our land. There's a separate question of, is it a good idea to give something that is ours away to other people in order to achieve peace with them? And I think for most Israelis, the consensus is, yes, in principle, we agree that in order to achieve peace, we should give away part of our land. But that since peace is not on offer in exchange for the land, there's no point in giving it away right now. And even, for example, I think yesterday, Yair Lapid said he favors a two-state solution. However, he has to acknowledge that at the moment there's no possibility of it being put into practice. I'd also like to add something else in terms of the idea of partition in general. I think it's also incumbent on people. If you support a two-state solution, I'm sort of equivocating when it comes to a two-state solution. Sometimes I think a one-state solution is a good idea. Sometimes I think there's no solution. Sometimes I think the two-state solution might be acceptable in certain circumstances. But I think one of the things to bear in mind is, even if you support a two-state solution, you have to acknowledge that the Palestinians in 100 years have shown absolutely zero interest in a two-state solution. That their objective, and this is another live stream we want to go into detail and show you like some of the history and what people were saying at the time. But fundamentally, the raison d'etre of Palestinian nationalism is to defeat Zionism, and a peace agreement whereby Israel still exists is not a historic achievement for Palestinian nationalism. It's acceptance of a historic defeat. It's acceptance that they have failed in their original aim. And I think often we don't address that give that any consideration in terms of trying to explain why Palestinian political leaders behave in the way that they do.
We've got a few more questions coming through, so I'm going to rattle through them. So, what's with the sudden change of opinion on Israelis in Hollywood? It seems that back in the 90s, Hollywood loved Israel, but now it's 50-50, and that's a reflection of America. As America moves more to the left, unfortunately, Israel has become one of those. What used to be a bipartisan issue, you had support from both sides of the aisle. It's increasingly becoming a character trait that if you're on the left, you're pro-Palestinian, and if you're conservative, you're pro-Israel, which is absurd because it should span both sides of the aisle. You should have people on the left that are pro-Israel and people on the right that are pro-Israel. And similarly with Palestinians. But unfortunately, like gun control, climate change, it's become a tribal thing. So as the left becomes stronger in American circles, then Israel finds itself pushed out of those circles in many instances. So that was one of the questions. We then got another question from Alberto.
Can I just chime in on that?
Yeah, please quickly jump in. Yeah.
I think there's also a cultural, I mean, it is cultural, as you say, but I think there's also an aspect of this is 30 years after the 90s. There's a whole new generation that's been through the university system, and there is a huge problem in academia, not just in America, but also all over the Western world, of academics who essentially lie about Israel and call it research. For example, like Professor David Miller at Bristol, who try and couch their anti-Semitism in the guise of academia, which of course is not a new thing. The person who invented the term anti-Semitism, Wilhelm Marr, he chose that term as opposed to Jew hatred because he wanted it to sound more scientific and more academic. So this is something that's been going on since the 1870s. It just has a different manifestation.
So we've got another question now from Adalberto Maggio Jr. So Adalberto is clearly Muslim. This is a very, very, very Islamic question. Why won't Israel follow and impose the laws of the Torah and be a theocracy like Judaism commands them to? The Jewish people are not stuck in time, I think, is the simplest answer. We as a people have contributed in significant ways to the evolution and the progression of modern political systems. We've taken those systems with us when we've returned home, and we've continued to build on that. What I would, on a personal level, what I would like to see is more, not religious laws, but more of a Jewish framework applied to Israeli law. That's not to move to a theocracy, but it's already there to a degree. So some examples of how the fest is Israel. In Israel, the day of rest is Saturday. Why? Because Saturday is the Jewish day of rest, not Sunday. That's a Christian. Not Friday. That's Islam. And so there are already expressions of Judaism within Israeli society. But no, we're not a full-on theocracy. And I don't think we're ready for a theocracy. I, as an individual, would not trust the Rabbanim, the rabbis that we have today, to build the society that we used to have historically and that would be fitting for the Jewish people. We're too divided. The precedent used to be that to sit in what would have been the equivalent of the government, the Sanhedrin, you had to be a master of multiple languages, a master of the Torah, a master of science and mathematics and secular, like the brightest of Jewish society. And we had this incredible democratic system where this court would sit and enact laws, and if the people were able to keep the laws, they would be binding. But if they couldn't keep the laws, they would then be rejected. And so an example would be that we were told that we couldn't drink wine that had been handled by idolaters, and that was a law which the people were able to keep. We couldn't handle wine. We couldn't do. There were many laws relating to wine that had been handled by idolaters that we couldn't use for a variety of reasons. They also passed, the same courts passed a law which banned olive oil that had been handled by idolaters. The people could keep the wine, but they couldn't keep the olive oil law. So that olive oil was taken back, was undone and retracted. And so
I think you've lost your microphone, Joe. I don't know if you can hear us, but we can't hear you.
Oh, you're joking.
Well, now we can hear you.
Okay. So it's probably my internet connection. Apologies. I was just saying there's instances of historical laws when Israel was a... Am I going in?
No, it might just be my headphones.
Okay, I'll keep talking and assume it's working. There are examples of where even when Israel was a theocracy, it worked like this not perfect, but this incredibly interesting democratic, meritocratic type society, which I don't think we have today. And so while I support, I would love to see the inclusion of Jewish traditions in Israeli law, enshrined in Israeli law, I don't want to see a theocracy because I don't think we as a nation are ready for that. Alexander, is there anything you'd like to add?
Yeah, so I think there's two things. There is a movement towards incorporating Jewish law into Israeli law as a source of what's the word? I don't know. I can't think of the word. But where there's not, so to get, maybe you'll understand what I'm talking about. To give a concrete example, so for example, on the issue of the law of return, if someone converts to another religion, there's a question of, are they allowed to make aliyah? And the courts have ruled that they're not. To go in the long and the short of it. And the reason they've done this is there's the secular law, the law of return, says if you're a Jew can make aliyah, and it says you're Jewish if you're basically recognized as a Jew by if you're born Jewish, or if someone will vouch for your Judaism. So when a question is someone who is, by the standards of halakha, is a Jew, but they've adopted another religion, can they still make aliyah and come and live in Israel? So the court said, well, the secular law isn't clear. So what did they do? They looked at the standards of halakha, and halakha says if you convert to another religion, you have cut yourself off from your people, and you're no longer a part of the Jewish people. And so the ruling ultimately, and this has been challenged a few times by people who've converted to other religions, particularly Messianic Jews. We've adopted a form of Christianity, but they may still be halakhically Jewish. They've tried to make aliyah under the law of return, and every time that this has happened, the Supreme Court has ruled that they're not able, they're not eligible under the law of return. I think the courts have always looked to halakha as something to help answer a legal question if there's no clear answer in the secular law, that the obvious place for a Jew to look, if there's nothing in modern secular Israeli law to answer a question, the obvious place to go and look is in Jewish law.
So we have another question, and I think you've staged this, Alexander. So it's not showing, unfortunately. So I'm just going to. It's coming up now. Richard Francis asks one more question. What do you think about Naphtali Bennett? Honest answer, please. And I'm laughing because truthfully, I think on an individual level, I think Naphtali Bennett has a terrible reputation in the Western press, which isn't deserved. He is, by every definition, moderate. He may support Jews in Judea and Samaria, but he also supports the Arabs that live there. He's not extremist in his views at all. So I think he has a very, very bad reputation because he's portrayed as being far right. I think in Israel, he's lost a lot of supporters because of the current coalition. But for me, I'm waiting to see what happens. I'm hopeful for good things. We have a coalition which has a very diverse range of opinions, which will either lead to complete paralysis or maybe it could lead to some innovations that are yet to see. So I'm on the fence. I'm waiting to see how it goes with Naphtali Bennett. Alexander Menashe maybe has a different take because,
So he's the Prime Minister of Israel first and foremost, so he deserves the respect as the leader of a Jewish nation. I think there's one thing which is perhaps overlooked is like he is the first Orthodox religious Jewish leader of an Israeli sovereign political entity for 2,000 years, and that's something we should all celebrate. I mean, if we're religious, I mean, I think that's a really remarkable thing that for the first time in 2,000 years, the Jewish people have a religious leader on the world stage. I think that's a momentous achievement for Zionism first and foremost. It's a momentous achievement for the Jewish people in our rebirth as a nation. And in terms of his politics, I think he's shown. I mean, people. I guess it depends what you think of him to begin with. If you think that he's a man of integrity, then, which I do, then I think you can look at the choices that he's made in the last few months, and say that he's put his own reputation on the line in order to do the best thing for the country. And I genuinely believe that that's his intention. Whether it transpires that the best thing for the country happens, if he's able to deliver on that, with, as Joe said, the diverse coalition, which it's got people who are fully supportive of various different woke left causes, and people and an Arab party that's strictly essentially a religious Muslim party that's utterly opposed to gay rights. You've got parties that support secular civil marriage, and parties who are completely opposed to that. You've got people who support concessions to the Palestinians, and then parties that are also opposed to that. So there's a diverse coalition. It's also, I think, it's got 61 members. It only takes one person to throw their toys out of the pram, and the government's going to find it very difficult to pass its agenda. But if people can, if people can work together, which is the premise of this, the premise of this government seems to be that if people can put their differences aside and concentrate on the things they agree on, we can get a lot done for the country. And we're already starting actually to see some of that agenda. It doesn't get talked about, but for example, there's an agenda to bring down food prices. It's not clear to me. I haven't studied it in enough detail to know whether it's going to work, but that's one of the things that they're working on in freeing up the economy, making the economy more. So one thing people might not know is that the founding generation who created Israel, they were all socialists. They were Labour Zionists. They believed in something very close to. I mean, one of the reasons that the British government opposed the creation of the State of Israel in 1948 was because they believed that the leaders of the Zionist leaders would join the Soviet bloc because they were so left-wing. So I think up until around the mid-80s, something about 85% of the economy was state-owned. So there's a lot of, if you like, archaic regulations that date back from these times. There's many inefficient state-owned industries that are potentially going to be privatized. There's discussions of all these kinds of things. There may be different reforms that can really move the economy and liberalize the economy to essentially give it a kickstart. The other one thing I would say that I think is useful for someone in a position of leadership, when it is something that Naphtali Bennett has, is he's able to approach. He's not he doesn't seem like someone who has a fixed idea in terms of approaching problems, that he's willing to consider innovative or what might be considered by others to be outlandish solutions. He'll sit down, if they're, and he'll actually give those ideas consideration, which other people might dismiss out of hand. And I think as someone who's running a country, you want someone who's like that, has an open mind about doing things differently. So good example. He's a huge champion of employment programs and schemes that target Arab women, to bring Arab women and Haredi men and women into the workforce. So actually, this is one thing. They've just lowered the exemption rate from the army to 21, which means that sorry, not the exemption rate. The point at which you become exempt from military service is now 21 in Israel. So it means that it used to be, I think, 26. So what it meant is that when someone goes to yeshiva, 17, 18, they study. By the time they're 21, they're married with children. Now, if you apply for a job in Israel, maybe people don't know this, but when you apply for a job in Israel, you have to show, your employer has to basically vouch for the fact that you've been legally released from the army, because there's a compulsory military service there. So when someone goes for a job interview, technically, although it doesn't probably happen very often, it's sometimes illegal for someone to offer someone a job because they're still of the age where they haven't been released by the army. So that's actually a barrier to Orthodox Jewish men entering the workforce. And what happens is that people stay in education, and by the time they reach the age where they can go out and work, there's a huge limit on what they can do, what skills they have, and so on. And in an attempt to try and change that and bring these people into the workforce and benefit the economy, they've lowered the age of exemption. So that's something that should, in future years, show a direct benefit to Israel.
So in case you missed that, the summary is he likes Naphtali Bennett. So too long didn't read. Alexander's pro Naphtali Bennett. Gollum one asks, showing up the question: "Why is apartheid okay? Islam, the pillow, and China? Apartheid isn't all right. So it's not only okay. Apartheid does not exist in Israel, but the reason why the West turns a blind eye to apartheid, be it gender apartheid, racial apartheid, or religious apartheid, in some of the regimes you mentioned, is because of the bigotry of low expectations. The West holds these nations to a lower standard than they hold themselves to, which is classic bigotry of low expectations. We've got a few more questions, which I'm going to quickly roll through because we are getting quite late. I think I like this question.
On one thing.
Quickly, because we've got to roll through a lot.
yeah. I'm not going to go as long as last time. Just in terms of apartheid, I think it's like throwing these terms around like confetti. Is like apartheid's a very specific thing, and I don't like using apartheid to refer to things that aren't apartheid, just because it's like convenient to make a political point.
So the next question is from Got It, and I think I've just lost it, unfortunately, because so many comments have now just been posted. So let me just find it. Bear with me. I liked it. It was a good question. I've lost it. Sorry, apologies about this. No, I've gone too far. Got it. And this is why we need a moderator to do the questions.
Yeah. If anybody wants to volunteer as a moderator for the show, then please get in touch with either Joseph or myself.
So let me. Okay, if you just hold off, I continue to talk about that last.
Okay.
But
so apartheid. For people that don't know, there's a convention called the Convention on the Crime. Oh, now I've forgotten the name of it. There's an international convention that was adopted. Oh, you found the question. Yeah, let's go.
Perfect. Okay, so What is the defining feature of Jewish life today, according to you guys? And I think it's a good question. And so for me, it's a very simple answer, and I'll let Alexander Menashe give his. But for me, the defining feature of Jewish life is obedience to the commandments. Now, it doesn't mean that you take on every single Jewish commandment, because there's a lot of them and not everyone's religious. But all of our traditions are rooted in Jewish law. And so it's obedience to one, some, or all of those, whether it's lighting Shabbat candles, whether it's refraining from work on a Saturday, whether it's practicing the laws of family purity, whether it's refraining from eating bacon. These are the defining features of Jewish life today. And if you're not doing one, some, or all of those things, you're not really living a Jewish life. Anything to add, Alexander?
Not really. I think just like you said, for me, the defining idea of Jewish life is to accept the commandments, to accept the obligation to fulfill the commandments. None of us are perfect, so we're all, even the holiest of rabbis is going to be doing something that's not halakhically 100%, because we've all got some kind of teshuva to do before. We've got another 13 days to go before Yom Kippur. So I think it's accepting the as what is called ul shamayim, the yoke of heaven.
And so we've now got Kenny Ken is in the house. Kenny Ken is our resident Pakistani lovely lunatic. He believes that Pakistan is the real Israel and the future caliphate of the world. And he's now informed us that the Taliban are the children of Israel. If they are the children of Israel, they need to start behaving like the children of Israel instead of some 7th century extremist, violent, I'm going to say it, terrorists. Then the Taliban are not good people. And so if they truly are the children of Israel, which may be all right, maybe you're wrong, then they need to start behaving like the children of Israel. Because we've got a great moral code. Yeah.
So one of the defining features, there's actually a thing amongst Hasidic Jews that they say that one of the defining features of Judaism or the Jewish people is kindness, and that actually if someone is unkind, that's a basis for perhaps questioning something about their lineage. So the Taliban, they're not very kind people, so I think they're probably not part of the Jewish people. And if they want to become part of the Jewish people or return to the Jewish people, they've got to change their ways. Put it that way.
David Collier quite rightly pointed out that we're being too kind to the Taliban. I just don't want to hurt Kenny Ken's feelings. He's one of our biggest fans. And so I'm trying to be polite, but yes, we are being too kind to the Taliban. Only hence do we want to see the siege on Gaza to be lifted. On a personal level, yes, I do, but completely understand why it's there, because if it were lifted, you would see a tsunami of weapons hit the Gaza Strip that would then be fired directly at my family in Israel. So completely understand why it's there, but obviously nobody wants to see anywhere blockaded. But yeah, it's there for a reason. We've got so many questions. We'll do 12 more minutes, then we are going to end the stream because I want to go to bed.
So just on that last question, do you want the siege of Gaza to be lifted? I think it's a silly question, if I'm perfectly honest, because the question is, do you want it to be lifted unconditionally, or what conditions would you support lifting the siege of Gaza? It's there, as you just said, Joe. It's there for a reason. It's there to save lives and if you have to make a choice. This is sometimes where we don't really get into some of the moral thinking and some of the moral principles, but in any moral system, we put the right to life right at the top. So if there's people whose whose freedom to import certain things is limited, I think most moral systems would agree that the solution is to restrict the freedom of people to import certain products, as opposed to giving people the freedom to go out and murder people. So, yeah.
So I'll very quickly answer Adalberto's next question. So this is the Muslim chap from before. What do you think of the instances of racism against Black Jews by other Jews in Israel? The marches and documentaries about it. How does the reality compare to the buzz? I think it's a really good question. I would encourage you, Adalberto. There are many Ethiopian Jews who, and Jews, not just Ethiopian Jews, who live in Israel, who have Twitter accounts. Drop them a message, ask them for their lived experience rather than the AJ Plus, Al Jazeera, TRT, RT, sensationalist, anti-Israel narratives. You'll find the overwhelming majority of them will tell you their daily experience is fantastic. Israel went to great lengths to save these people because they are Jews. Bring them to Israel, integrate them like they do all Jews into Israeli society. The reality doesn't match up to the AJ Plus anti-Israel videos that you'll see on YouTube. There is racism in Israel. There's racism in every country. Israel isn't perfect. There are racist Jews, just like there are racist Muslims, racist Christians, racist white people, racist Black people. Jews, like any other people, you will find there are Jews that are racist against Black people, but they are a tiny minority of Israeli society, and Israeli society at an institutional level and societal level is not racist against Black Jews. We see them as our brothers, but obviously it isn't perfect, and there are areas of Israeli society where there are issues because we're not a perfect society. I'm going to quickly race through any other questions. You can add to that. Yeah.
So, I think this is just okay. So the first thing, what do I think about racism? Racism is disgusting. That's that. It's absolutely reprehensible. It should be condemned in the strongest possible terms. It's totally illogical. It's without foundation. That's the first thing. What do I think about documentaries that have been made about racism against Black Jews? I think it's like the kind of stuff that you used to see in the Soviet Union, which would criticize America about the Jim Crow South or the civil rights movement. It wasn't because the people making those arguments couldn't care less about the racism suffered by Black Jews. It's just a propaganda point to have a go against Israel. To have a go
Completely agree. Couple more questions. Do you guys plan on doing Aliyah? Yes, we both do. In the near future, in Yud Hashem. But next question is, Alex, did you go to Cubs Scouts or play for a Sunday League team? Trying to figure out where I know you from. Going back years, though, many years.
It's many years when I did used to play for a Sunday League team. I'm not going to tell you which one it is. I also did go to the Scouts. Again, I'm not going to tell you which one it is. But if you want to contact me privately, and I can find out who you are, because I don't recognise your photograph, then maybe we can find out where you know me from.
So we got a few comments. The Black Jews are very good looking. I agree, but so are the gingers. Okay, I think on that one we'll call it a day. We've been going at nearly an hour and a half now. So if you'd like to support us in our channel, you can do so via Patreon, via all the usual fun. So you can make sure that you're following us on all of our social medias. I'm trying to get rid of the current quotes so you can see them, but let me do it this way. Just do that. Right. Okay. There we go. So that's how you can support us on Patreon. You can support us by following us on Twitter, YouTube, Facebook, and Instagram. Definitely make sure that you're following us on Instagram because we need to grow that. And if you're not already subscribed on YouTube, please head over, subscribe, hit the notification bell so you never miss a video. And make sure that you're following Alexander Menashe on Twitter. You can find him. His name is in his handle. Make sure you don't put an extra E between the D and the R. It's Alexander Menashe, not Alexander Menashe. So yeah, thank you very much for tuning in, and we'll see you soon.
Thanks, and of course to all of our Jewish listeners, or all of our Jewish audience, we wish you a Shana Tova Umetuka, that you would have a sweet and happy New Year. And
to our non-Jewish followers, we wish you a sweet Jewish New Year. And we're a few years ahead of you.